Back today for a video on the stretch reflex. A little bit more detail there, and then we'll say a little bit about the Golgi tendon reflex. These are both skeletal muscle, therefore somatic reflexes, somatic motor reflexes. Let me start by sort of laying out their functions. Right, so the stretch reflex involves a specific receptor structure that's called the muscle spindle. I'll give you a very generic, cartoonish version of its structure in a minute. And the muscle spindle is involved in actually two different functions. One would probably be described as protective. And in that function, what it's doing is it's tending to contract a muscle that's becoming stretched. So when a muscle is unconsciously lengthened, this receptor senses that and will generate output to contract that same muscle. It's going to be very easily demonstrated. Get a family member or a roommate to sort of close their eyes and hold their hands out in front of them like this, and don't tell them what's coming, and then just sort of like drop a book into their hands, nothing too heavy, and even with their eyes closed and not knowing that it's coming, as soon as that book hits their hands, it'll stretch the biceps muscles and generate reflexive tension through the stretch reflex. And it's sort of an easy way to demonstrate it. Another example of the stretch reflex is the knee-jerk reflex that you've all experienced at the doctor's office. It's a sort of testing neuronal function where they tap the patellar tendon with a rubber hammer, and that actually stretches the quadriceps muscle in the front of the thigh and generates the same type of reflexive contraction. You can sort of kick your foot out a little bit in response to that stretch. So protective would be one function. And what I would also say there is that it's detecting, so this muscle spindle is detecting length of the muscle and changes in length. Right, and the second is probably the more important or the more obvious function. So this is feedback from the muscles. Again, this is not, don't think of it as only active when that's sort of that scenario where you're sort of unexpectedly stretching a muscle. They do give feedback continuously about the length of the muscle, and even more specifically, changes in length. The other function of the muscle spindle falls under a category we'll call proprioception. Right, and so again, this sort of this could sort of fit in the middle here. The proprioception is basically awareness of self, and so and again, there are a lot of other receptors involved in this, but the muscle spindle is one of them. If you close your eyes, you kind of know where your limbs are in space, and that has to do with receptors that are in the joints, receptors that are in the muscle tendons, and receptors in the skin, but also the receptors in the muscle that are telling us a bit about the length and or changes in length that are occurring. And so those are two sort of interrelated functions of the muscle spindle and the stretch reflex. I want to say a little bit about, we'll also say a little bit about the Golgi tendon reflex. And that's largely about proprioception, and we could put protection there too. And what we should say now is that it's not detecting, and so these guys were found within the muscle. The Golgi tendon reflex, those are found at the junction between the muscle and the tendon. The stretch reflex, that structure is in parallel to the contractile muscle fibers, and so as the muscle is stretched, those same the whole muscle is stretched, so are the muscle spindles. The Golgi tendon reflex, those are the receptors there are found in series with the contractile fibers. In other words, the contractile cells of the muscle pull on the Golgi tendon receptors, essentially, right? In other words, they're in line with them, as opposed to side by side as the muscle spindles are. And what that means is that this guy is a lot better at sensing tension in the muscle as opposed to length. And again, so it's telling us about proprioception. It's telling us about the tension feedback, about how much tension we're generating in that muscle. And it's protective in that if the tension, as tension rises, this guy is sort of modulating the output. And what it can do is it can be protective by inhibiting output to the muscle if tension becomes very high. Now that's fairly extreme. Probably more commonly, it's just involving modulating muscle tension during a contraction. It's making sure that tension matches need, essentially. Okay, so let's do a little bit of anatomy here. Find a red pen. So I'm going to draw a muscle, and then I'm going to squeeze a spinal cord up here. So let's draw a muscle. All right, we've got our tendons on the ends. Right. Those are connective tissue that runs actually through the muscle, but then it attaches it to the bones at the ends. And so let's label those things. So this is the muscle belly. And then we have muscle fibers, the cells of the muscle that would be running sort of lengthwise along this muscle belly. And what I'm drawing right now is it's called an intrafusal fiber. So this is a muscle fiber, a muscle cell. And this guy's really not adapted to generate tension. It's really not there to shorten the muscle. This is the guy that has I changed my color here. This is the guy that has a sensory neuron wrapped around it, essentially. Right? So there's a sensory neuron wrapped around this intrafusal fiber. I'll label that. Right? And again, this is the muscle fiber associated with the muscle spindle. So the muscle spindle is sort of this combination of the intrafusal fiber and this sensory neuron wrapped around it. And again, that's the guy that's going to sense whether this muscle is shortening or lengthening, and can tell you about its length at a given moment as well. And there's a couple different versions of this and whether they adapt quickly or not to changes. We can talk about that later. The other fibers I need to talk about are the contractile fibers of most of the fibers of this muscle, right? The ones you would think of as sort of like, these are the cells that, and I'll just draw one, and I'll sort of put some hash marks on it here so we can separate it. Right? Again, these are both muscle cells, but two different versions. Right? That guy is actually called an extrafusal fiber. Extrafusal fibers are the ones that are going to generate tension. Those are the ones that are under conscious control that we contract to move the, the bones that are attached to the ends here. Okay, so how's this thing work? Well, so this sensory neuron, the blue guy here, has nerve endings that are wrapped around this intrafusal fiber. And when that intrafusal fiber is stretched, these nerve endings are distorted. They're stretched too. And they have mechanically gated channels, right? So it's a mechanotransducer or mechanosensor. It's sensing the change in something physical here, in case this is a stretch of the muscle. And so when it's stretched, we're going to get action potentials generated that are going to travel along this axon. And it's going to enter, right, cell body, right? Remember, this is a unipolar neuron. It's going to come into, and I'm going to draw my sort of a shrunken version of I'm going to draw most of it. Oops, a little bit high. Sorry. Right? There we go. So my cross section of the spinal cord cut off a little bit here. Right, just trying to make it big enough so we can see what's happening. So this guy is going to come in through the dorsal root, right, because it's sensory. And it wasn't quite high enough, but it's working. Right? And it's going to come in there, and it's going to synapse actually directly with a motor neuron in the ventral gray horn, right? This came in through, I didn't draw the gray matter, right? But it's coming in through the dorsal gray horn, and it's going to synapse with a cell in the ventral gray horn. And that guy is going to send a synapse or send an axon out to, you guessed it, right? The extrafusal fibers. So when we get stretch here, we get action potentials. We get synapse on the motor neuron directly. Notice there is no interneuron. We're going to get action potentials in this motor neuron, this lower motor neuron, that's going to innervate and activate this extrafusal fiber. Now, it wouldn't innervate a single fiber. It would innervate dozens or even hundreds of fibers. There would be branching off this axon. We're leaving out that complexity here. Okay, and that effectively is the reflex arc of a stretch reflex. Okay, now let's throw in, because here's the thing, think about this. If we ever use the example with somebody dropping a book in your hands with you not being aware of it, right? So when we do that, we would stretch the biceps muscle. Well, when we stretch the biceps muscle, right, we shorten the triceps muscle, right? And then as that biceps muscle gets contracted in response, we stretch the antagonistic muscle, right? And so it was sort of like we took the tension off the tricep, then we got a stretch reflex, contracted, and we stretched the antagonistic muscle. All right, well, let's put the antagonistic muscle over here. So here's the bone, right? Just on the sort of a very generic limb here. Let's put a muscle on the opposite side. Of the bone, kind of an odd-shaped muscle there. But you get the idea. There's the tendon again, right? And now, right, we are going to stretch this guy when this guy contracts, right, in response to that stretch, which means that we're going to get a stretch reflex here, right? Well, you don't want that, because then pretty much every time that you lengthen your arm, you'd get a stretch reflex, right? Every time you contract, let's go the other way to match what I was saying. Every time you contract your arm, right, flex your arm, you would contract the biceps but stretch the triceps muscle, in which case the triceps muscle, the stretch reflex there would cause you to extend, which would stretch the biceps, which would contract, which would stretch the triceps, which would contract. And you'd be stuck going back and forth and back and forth. So you need to inhibit the antagonistic muscle all the time. That every time you move, we need to the contraction of one muscle stretches another. And we don't want to initiate a stretch reflex there, because it's not being protective, it's inhibiting your movement. And so what we need is something that looks like this. So this guy, right, so our sensory neuron comes in, it's going to synapse on an interneuron. Guess what? This interneuron is an inhibitory interneuron. So let's put a big fat negative sign next to that. Right, because it's going to tend to inhibit the output of the motor neuron. And again, motor neurons, because it'd be more than one. Right, so we're inhibiting this guy, because remember, we could redraw this down here, because every time you contract this, you stretch this and generate a stretch reflex that would contract this. But we don't want that to happen. And so when this guy gets stretched, we're going to inhibit that motor neuron, right? And so we get no contraction, right, in response to the stretch reflex in the antagonistic muscle. And that is called reciprocal inhibition. Right? The reciprocal muscle is inhibited. And again, it goes both ways. If you're trying to extend your arm, you would be stretching the biceps. We need to inhibit the biceps. So you'd be inhibiting this one instead of this one. Right? So the antagonistic muscle is inhibited through reciprocal inhibition. All right. One other thing I wanted to talk about is the Golgi tendon reflex. I just really wanted to point out sort of where those guys are found. So I'm going to put a sensory neuron right here, and I'm not going to, right, it would come up and do this bit, and I'm just going to put an arrow here because I don't want to try to draw all the wiring of that. And again, this guy is sensing the linear tension being generated along that muscle. It's telling us about the tension in that muscle. It's helping us adjust the tension during a contraction. And again, at high tension and therefore output along the sensory neuron would tend to generate feedback that would be inhibitory. It would tend to limit the contractile strength so that we don't injure the muscle by initiating contractions that are so powerful they're damaging. Okay, last thing, quick summary, right? We talked about the stretch reflex and all its sort of wiring and function. Keep in mind that this would be a somatic reflex as opposed to visceral. It would be ipsilateral, right? Because it's coming in and then going back out to the same side, right? We're antagonizing the reciprocal inhibition is antagonizing the muscle on the same side. The stretch reflex is contracting the muscle on the same side. There's nothing shooting over to the opposite side, right? Remember, that would be contralateral. That's not happening. In this scenario, it's monosegmental. It's tending to stay in and out of the spinal cord at one region. It is spinal, but this example is spinal reflex, but it can be cranial. We could talk about versions of this that are coming in and out of cranial nerves. And again, with regard to just the stretch reflex arc, this guy right here, blue to orange, it is monosynaptic. If you look at the component that is reciprocal inhibition, that's not the stretch reflex, then that would be polysynaptic, right? Because we've got an interneuron in there. Okay.